Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Horror Hill. I'm your host, Erik Peabody, and today we're going to be doing something a little different. In fact, this isn't an episode at all. I thought it might be fun to give you a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at what goes into the recording of a Horror Hill segment. Now, we're not going to get super technical about anything here, but you're always welcome to reach out to me if you want more details, or if you want to hire me for your project. Let's start by talking a bit about the space that I'm in. As you might know, my days are split between voice work and other audio production services. Since I mix and master audio for bands and other voice artists, my studio space is set up to provide a neutral listening environment so that I can make informed decisions while mixing, as well as to reduce flutter echoes, which you'll frequently hear in voice recordings in untreated environments. You'll recognize the presence of those because the recording will sound very much like it's in a room, with one classic example being someone recording in a tiled bathroom. My studio here is custom built and also does a pretty good job at keeping external sound out, but the reality of the situation is that this room is in my house, which is in a residential area, so certain sounds like lawnmowers, motorcycles, and so forth sometimes creep in, and I have to do my best to work with them. Now, as far as equipment goes, there are 4 items that are most relevant. First is the microphone itself. I use a Neumann TLM 102 on a boom arm that is mounted on a separate surface than the main desk. This is to prevent vibrations from the main desk as I shift around, or whatever, from resonating up into the mic and showing up in the recording. From there, the mic connects to a preamp, a Warm Audio WA12 Mark II. This amplifies the signal to something usable and imparts a little bit of tonal character to the recording. After that, the signal goes into a compressor, in this case an FMR RNC 1773. Without going into detail, this helps keep the volume in a smaller range so there isn't as much volume disparity between the quietest parts of the recording and the louder parts. Lastly, the signal goes into my audio interface, which converts the analog signal to a digital one that my computer can process. For my VO work, I'm using a Line 6 Toneport UX2. Now, those of you that are into home recording will recognize this as a fairly budget-conscious option that was released about 15 years ago. And yes, there are far better options on the market, but for this limited use case, it works great for me. Also, you've probably noticed the guitars in the back of the room. They have nothing to do with Horror Hill, but I love showing them off. So far, we haven't even talked about the most important element, the stories themselves. The team at Horror Hill sources stories in a few different ways. First off, we have a submission email address, submissions@simplyscarypodcast.com, where people like you, yes you listener, can submit your own stories for consideration. In addition to these, myself and the rest of the team will sometimes come across stories out in the wild, whether it's through fiction forums or subreddits, independently published stories or collections, or by knowing someone that writes stories. Out of these 2 pools, submissions and discoveries, we sometimes end up forming a relationship with a writer and can tap them directly for additional stories for future episodes. Lastly, we have special case situations. We'll sometimes read a public domain story, such as our Halloween reading of H.P. Lovecraft's Pickman's Model, or we'll contact a more well-known author to cover a story of theirs. Also, I'd like to note that all of the stories we feature on Horror Hill are properly licensed from their respective rights holders. So once we've assembled the stories, or story, that will be featured in an episode, I go through and give each one an initial read. I'm looking for some specific things while I do this. The location and time frame that the story takes place in, the general vibe of the story structure, including any unexpected twists, how many unique characters there are, and the traits of those characters, like age, gender, personality, and any regional accents that I'll have a chance to butcher. And lastly, any words that I'm unfamiliar with and need to learn how to pronounce properly. All of these factors inform my delivery during the recording. For example, if the story is about emotional fallout over the loss of a loved one, I'm going to voice it differently than I would a tale about some young friends having an adventure in a haunted house. And once I've got all of that sorted out for each story, I write the wraparound host segment for the episode. This includes everything that you hear from me besides the story itself, like the introduction, story synopses, outro segment, and any other tidbits that are relevant to the show, like specific content warnings and author bios. Now that all of the prep work is done, we're ready to jump into the fun part, the actual recording. The first thing I do is properly position my microphone. I usually keep it a bit closer than it is right now because when I'm not on camera, I don't need to worry about keeping my face visible. You generally want your mic close enough so that it's not picking up the room more than it's picking up your voice, but not so close that you're getting too much mouth noise or plosives or anything like that. Once that's all in place, I make sure that all of the relevant equipment is turned on because it's super fun recording some VO while your preamp is secretly turned off, and I open up my recording software. I use a program called Reaper, which is an acronym for Rapid Environment for Audio Production, Engineering, and Recording. Reaper is incredibly powerful, and I use it for pretty much everything I do in the audio world, including running amp processing, backing tracks, and visuals for my live performances. What you're seeing now on screen is a template I created for VO recording. And we're not going to get too far into the weeds here, but the basic gist is that this software lets me record my voice, do any editing that I need to, and then process it so it sounds nice and polished. I start each recording session by recording about 20 seconds of nothing. Well, not exactly nothing, but just the sound of my room. This creates a noise profile of all the little audible things that I probably don't want in the finished recording. After all, even though I've taken steps to limit unwanted noise, we are still in a room in a house. We'll use this room tone sample, as it's called, a bit down the line. And from here, we record the actual content. I pull up the manuscript, hit record, and start performing. Now, since I'm a fallible bag of meat and liquid like every other person on the planet, I make mistakes. Some folks handle mistakes using a method called punch and roll, where they'll stop recording, back up to before the mistake, and re-record over it, which results in needing less editing after the fact. However, that's never really worked well for me. I find it distracting, and it makes it easier for me to fall out of the groove that I get into while I'm narrating. So I use a method with a dog clicker. That's right, a dog clicker, a small tool with a button that makes a distinctive clicking noise, which is very easy to see when I'm reviewing the finished recording. Every time I make a mistake, I click the dog clicker and record a new take of the line in question, and you'll see how this is beneficial in just a bit. So at this point, we have a recording of the story. Now I can turn off the performance part of my brain and get down to the technical stuff. First off, I go through and find every place that I see my dog clicker show up in the waveform. By the way, I usually do this starting at the end of the recording and moving backwards. The reason that I do it this way is that I almost always end up using the last take of a line, and sometimes I have multiple takes before I get the line right. So if I start at the end and work backwards, this makes it easier for me to identify which take I'm going to use. I go through the whole file, cutting out bad takes and giving a quick listen to the edits after I make them, just to make sure I haven't screwed up anything. Once that's done, I bounce the recording to a new track. Now, I have several audio processing effects in place that clean up the audio, removing mouth noise and computer hum and so forth. After all, these processing tools take up a certain amount of CPU speed, which means that the computer runs a bit more sluggishly when it's running audio through them in real time. Once I bounce a new version of the audio with all of this extra processing already cooked in, things will run more smoothly as I continue editing. Next, I run two processes that collectively clear out all the space between lines, space which might have noise that I don't want, and replace it with clean room tone of a predetermined length. I'll grab a segment of the room tone from earlier, trim it down to what I feel is an appropriate default spacer between sentences, and then run the two processes. This gives me a good baseline so that when I'm doing my final listen through, I'm not necessarily having to micromanage each line. Now, I'll grab a smaller sample of that same room tone and start my final listen through. As I'm listening, I'm doing a few different things. First off, I have the manuscript open on my second monitor, and I'm following along as I listen to make sure I don't miss any lines or accidentally edit them out or anything like that. I'm also listening for unwanted noises like mouth clicks, low-end thumps, plosives that I need to edit out. Lastly, I'm listening for narrative flow, making sure that the spacing between lines and paragraphs makes sense from a storytelling standpoint. If I need a longer silence, I'll drop in a copy of the small room tone clip. If I need it shortened, I'll just trim some out. And at this point, the editing is done. I'll bounce the recording one final time through a different set of effects processors like equalization and compression and so forth to get the final file. I then send that to Natalie, an essential person in the Horror Hill team, and she takes it from there. And that wraps things up. I hope that you found this informative, and if you're interested in learning more about any part of this process, or if you're looking to hire a voice actor or audio engineer for your project, you're always welcome to email me at ericpeabodyvoice@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in to this special behind-the-scenes look at Horror Hill. And until next episode, listeners, stay spooky.